Our planet Earth is an amazing place, full of all sorts of different landscapes that range from rivers winding through valleys to thick forests and dense jungles, along with dry deserts and towering mountains. These different types of land come packed with natural resources, and throughout history, humans have found ways to use those resources to survive, grow, and build the world we know today. At first, people lived in small groups, but over time, those groups became villages. Then those villages expanded into towns, and eventually, towns grew into cities. As civilizations developed, some became powerful city-states, and before long, those city-states turned into kingdoms and empires. But as much as humans have used their resources and energy to build things, they've also spent a lot of time fighting and tearing things down. From the very start of recorded history, humans, often greedy and self-serving, have used violence and warfare to take what wasn't theirs. The earliest war that we have any actual record of happened between Elam and the Sumerian king of Kish, who bragged about how he carried away the loot and weapons of his enemies after his victory. Of course, this isn't the first war ever. It's just the first one written down. There were probably many, many more before that, and countless others that came after. Of all the places on Earth, one of the most fought-over areas is the Levant. This region, which runs along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea, has been a battleground for thousands of years. The southern part of the Levant is often called Canaan, and while it isn't overflowing with resources like some other parts of the world, it's still been extremely important for a very long time. Why? Because of its strategic location. Canaan sits at a major crossroads. It connects Egypt to the south with the rest of the Near East, and because of that, it was a crucial area for armies on the march and traders moving goods. Whoever controlled Canaan could control the movement of goods, which meant they could tax trade and gain a lot of wealth. But as desirable as Canaan was, it wasn't easy to hold on to. The land itself is full of natural obstacles. Even though it's relatively small, Canaan is a diverse place with all sorts of different climates, terrain, and elevations. It can be divided into 4 main regions: the coastal plain, the hill country, the Jordan Rift Valley, and the Transjordan Plateau. Each of these areas has its own unique challenges, and these natural divisions made it hard for anyone to unite or control all of Canaan. For example, most of the rainfall happens west of the Jordan River, which means that the land to the east in the Rift Valley gets much less rain. The best farmland was found along the coastal plain, but even there, people had to deal with the constant threat of droughts and famines. Because of that, people in Canaan had to be smart about storing food and water for tough times. When droughts hit and they didn't have enough supplies, they were often left with 2 options: fight or flee. The rough, hilly terrain made it even harder to bring all the different groups of people together. It was every city, tribe, and family for themselves, which made things chaotic. The Canaanites who lived in the region were the original inhabitants, and although they shared a lot of common ground in terms of language, religion, and culture, they were often divided and at odds with one another. When times got hard, some chose to leave and seek refuge in other places. Many Canaanites fled to places like Mesopotamia or Egypt when things got tough at home. These regions had large, open river valleys that offered plenty of fresh water and farmland, but not much in the way of natural defenses. On the other hand, the hill country of Canaan, though less fertile, offered excellent natural defenses. The steep hills and rugged terrain made it difficult for armies to attack, so cities built there were often chosen for their strategic defensive advantages, even if the farmland wasn't the best. Cities like Jerusalem, Hebron, and Lachish thrived in the hill country because of their strong defensive positions. Up in the north, the hill country and the coastal plain start to blend together. This area was densely forested, and the people who lived there, known later as the Phoenicians, became expert sailors and traders. They harvested high-quality wood from their forests, which was in high demand all around the ancient world. While the hill country of Canaan was unique in its own right, the Jordan Rift Valley stands out as one of the most extreme features on Earth. It contains the Dead Sea, which is the lowest point of land on the planet. The Dead Sea is so salty that nothing can live in it, and it's 6 times saltier than the ocean, so it's pretty useless for anything practical. The Sea of Galilee, also in the Rift Valley, is much fresher and more useful. In the southern part of the rift, things are dry and desolate, but in the north, it's a lot wetter, with plenty of water, wildlife, and farmland. For about 1,000 years, the northern city-state of Hazor was a major power in the Jordan Rift. The kings of Hazor often led coalitions of other northern Canaanite city-states. In the south, Jericho was one of the few important cities. Jericho's claim to fame was its abundant supply of fresh water, which made it a valuable city in an otherwise dry area. To the east of the Jordan River, on the Transjordan Plateau, 2 other groups, known as the Ammonites and the Moabites, formed their own centralized kingdoms during the later part of the 2nd millennium BC. These kingdoms were located in river valleys, fed by underground springs that eventually flowed into the Jordan River. In the northern part of the Transjordan, the Amorites and later the Arameans became dominant powers. The economies of both Ammon and Moab relied heavily on trade, specifically the inland trade routes that connected the Near East with Egypt. These routes also passed through Edom, another significant region. Like the Canaanites, the Ammonites and Moabites were Semitic-speaking people who shared cultural and linguistic similarities with their neighbors. They didn't have the best land to farm on, that's for sure. The areas they occupied weren't exactly the most fertile, so instead of relying on farming, they mostly lived as semi-nomadic herders, moving around with their animals. And when they couldn't make ends meet by taxing trade routes that passed through, they turned to other methods of survival, like raiding. They would strike as far north as the Jezreel Valley or head west, right to the borders of Egypt, taking what they needed by force. The Egyptians were quick to realize the importance of Canaan early on. All the way back in the first dynasty of pharaohs, they built a fortress near what would later become the city of Gaza. This fortress wasn't just for show. It was there to protect Egypt's military and economic interests in the region. But after a few centuries, the Canaanites who lived along the coast managed to take back the area. Fast forward to the early Bronze Age, and Canaan started to see its fortified towns grow into full-blown cities. Some of the biggest and most well-known were places like En-Assur, Megiddo, and of course, Jericho. But the good times didn't last. Toward the end of the early Bronze Age, many of these big cities were abandoned, and the people returned to simpler, more rural ways of life. Smaller farming villages became the norm again, and many people started living in a semi-nomadic fashion, much like their ancestors had. Then came the Middle Bronze Age, and cities made a comeback, bigger and better than before. Hazor rose to power in the north, becoming the dominant city-state, while cities like Ashdod and Ashkelon became important hubs on the coastal plain. In the hill country, places like Lachish, Jerusalem, and Hebron began to grow in importance as well. Trade was booming, and with it came a new era of prosperity for Canaan. But with prosperity came danger. The powerful empires of the region couldn't ignore Canaan anymore, and they began to apply military pressure. Egypt wasn't the only empire with its eyes on Canaan. Far to the north, the Amorite kingdom of Katna was putting the squeeze on the Canaanites as well. They extracted tribute from the northern cities, and Hazor even became a vassal of Katna for a time. Meanwhile, in the south, Egypt also made its move. Pharaoh Senwosret III is the first recorded Egyptian ruler to have campaigned in Canaan, forcing the Canaanite kings to become his vassals and regularly sending tribute back to Egypt. This military pressure may have been one of the reasons why many Canaanites decided to leave their homes and head into the Nile Delta. These Canaanite migrants were later called the Hyksos by the Egyptians. Around 1650 BC, the Hyksos managed to overthrow the Egyptian government and ruled as pharaohs in the Nile Delta for about a century. But eventually, the Egyptians struck back, driving them out and reclaiming their lands. This traumatic experience left Egypt determined to never let something like that happen again. They heavily militarized and made it their top priority to keep control over Canaan to prevent another Hyksos invasion. From the start of the Egyptian New Kingdom, the pharaohs led repeated military campaigns into the Levant. They brought all of Canaan under their control, making the Canaanite city-states their vassals. One of the most notable of these campaigns was led by Thutmose III. When several city-states in the region rebelled, he marched his army to the famous Battle of Megiddo. This battle is the earliest in history for which we have detailed written records, including tactics, numbers, and even the loot taken afterward. Despite his victory at Megiddo, it took Thutmose III nearly 14 years of annual campaigns to finally crush all the rebellions in the Levant. The city of Megiddo was incredibly important strategically. It controlled access to the Jezreel Valley, which was a vital crossroads for all the major trade routes connecting the Canaanite coast to the rest of the Near East. Because of its location, the Jezreel Valley has been the site of countless battles throughout history. Famous figures like Napoleon and Saladin fought there, and even in modern times the valley saw major battles, such as the clash between British and Ottoman forces in 1918 during World War I. According to the Bible, Israel's first king, Saul, was killed in battle near the Jezreel Valley while fighting the Philistines. And as mentioned in the book of Revelation, it's prophesied that the final battle, Armageddon, will take place in this same valley, near Megiddo. In fact, the word Armageddon is just a Greek form of the name Megiddo. Back in ancient times, the Egyptians knew the strategic importance of this region, so they built a fortress and an administrative center at the junction of the Jezreel Valley and the Jordan Rift. For over 350 years, Egypt maintained control over Canaan. Although there were numerous rebellions and territorial losses, the Egyptians always managed to hold on to their top priority, securing the Road of Horus. This road allowed them to maintain military and economic control of the region. For a long time, things in Canaan were relatively peaceful. Egypt engaged in diplomacy with other major powers in the Near East, and the region experienced a period of prosperity. But then, things took a sharp turn. Almost overnight, it seemed, the great empires of the Bronze Age collapsed. Cities were destroyed, people died in large numbers, and civilization itself seemed to fall apart. Literacy disappeared, and for a long time, the Near East was plunged into darkness. This era is known as the Bronze Age collapse, and if you want to learn more about it, I've made a couple of videos on the topic that you might find interesting. But for now, let's get back to Canaan. While the rest of the region was falling apart, a group known as the Sea Peoples, one of the most confusing and mysterious groups from this time, showed up. Among them were the Peliset, who tried and failed to invade Egypt by sea. Afterward, they were resettled in Canaan and eventually became known as the Philistines. They mixed with the remaining Canaanites and formed a new identity in the coastal regions. Meanwhile, Hebrew tribes filled the power vacuum left in the interior, eventually forming the Kingdom of Israel. This kingdom would later split into the northern Kingdom of Israel and the southern Kingdom of Judah. The city of Samaria became the new capital of the northern kingdom and was often at odds with the Aramean kingdom of Damascus. Up north, the coastal Canaanites, who had recovered relatively quickly, became known to the Greeks as the Phoenicians. These expert sailors and traders would go on to found the city of Carthage, which later became famous for its conflicts with Rome, especially under the leadership of its brilliant general Hannibal. As time went on, all the states of the Levant were eventually conquered or vassalized by the Assyrian Empire. After that, a string of successive empires took control of the region. Over time, the common language changed from many different Semitic dialects to Aramaic, then Greek, and finally Arabic. New people mixed with the old populations, and the Levant became a melting pot of different cultures. Today, many of the people who live in this region can trace some of their ancestry back to the ancient Canaanites. But exactly who is related to them, and to what extent, is a subject of much debate. Whatever the case may be, it's important to treat everyone with dignity and respect, regardless of their ancestry. What really matters is how people choose to live their lives and the actions they take, not who their ancestors were.